The Native American was a technological expert of the plains, turning simple natural materials into some of the most deadly armaments and effective survival gear of all time. He built tents that could stay put in a raging storm, and weapons to bring down a rampaging beast. But it was the American Indians' fighting spirit that put the fear of God into some of the baddest hombres who ever set out across the frontier.
Native Americans, next on Wild West Tech. Send up the smoke signals. Howdy, I'm Keith Carradine. If you were a Native American looking for a fight on the plains, you didn't have to look far. Sure, there was the white man, but tribes also fought each other. Many times it wasn't personal, just business. A quick and easy way to get your hands on some horses. In fact, any technology that could help a warrior was welcome. If that meant trading with the white man, so be it. But trading and tolerance only went so far. Sometimes the only way for an American Indian to respond to the white man's assault on the frontier was with total annihilation.
It was a fight that stretched for decades. A bloody clash scarred the last half of the 19th century. Native American warriors battled U.S. soldiers for dominance on the Great Plains. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were trying to hang on to traditional homelands. These territories stretched from the western borders of Iowa and Missouri to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, all the way from Canada to Mexico. In the fall of 1866, the conflict reached a proud Lakota war chief named Red Cloud. The U.S. Army had recently built 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail, a frontier wagon road that cut right through the heart of prime Lakota hunting grounds.
The Bozeman Trail was developed by John Bozeman about 1864 to carry goods. By that time, there had been several gold strikes out in the western part of Montana, and they needed a quicker, more direct route.
The constant rumble of Army supply wagons scared away the elk and buffalo herds, crucial to the Lakota's way of life. And this, Red Cloud would not tolerate. Lakota warriors began raiding traffic on the Bozeman Trail and attacking soldiers and civilians who ventured from the forts to cut and gather wood. But the Lakota couldn't drive the soldiers away. The problem wasn't one of numbers. Red Cloud had gathered hundreds of warriors. But the Lakota's primary weapon, the bow and arrow, was more than 2,000 years old, hardly the latest technology. Early arrows were tipped with brittle stones, such as flint or obsidian. A stone was chipped or knapped to a sharp point, then lashed to the end of an arrow shaft with animal tendon. It's believed the bow and arrow was first brought to the Great Plains sometime between 500 and 600 BC. Later, European traders supplied tribes with prefabricated metal tips that had often been hand-forged by blacksmiths in Europe. These thinner, flatter steel tips fit much more easily and securely into wooden arrow shafts and had greater durability than stone. As white settlers ventured onto the plains, warriors found another source for metallic arrowheads.
We would take barrel hoops or wagon wheels and take the iron from that and manufacture arrow points out of iron.
At the opposite end of the arrow, fletching made of bird feathers helped stabilize the missile in flight.
There's fletching of hawk feathers, wild turkey wings, which was much more suitable under many conditions. They're a lot more durable. Eagle feathers were seldom used at all, just because of the fragility of the feather.
A Plains Indian carved bows from hard woods like ash, hickory, and Osage orange. The bow string was made from 5 or 6 strands of buffalo tendon or sinew, braided to form a tough cord.
What sinew was basically the muscle fiber, the tendon that ran along either the backbone of the elk or buffalo or its leg. And it's a very wide tendon, and it could be basically ripped apart into very fine fibers or strings, so to speak, and it's very, very strong. You cannot break it with your hand.
This is Aaron Ten Bears of the Lakota Nation. He's going to tell us about that most familiar piece of Native American technology, the bow and arrow. Aaron, these bows that you have here, are these typical from the 1860s?
Yeah, they sure are. They're seldom longer than 3 feet in length, so this way they'd easily be adaptable and able to be fired on horseback.
And what was the typical range of this weapon?
Well, there are different variations of the short bow. These are what we call a self bow. They're not sinew-backed, and this would be the back of the bow. Sometimes they place sinew or rawhide or even snakeskin to help compound the bow and make it a little bit more powerful. So the average range on a self bow, you'd be looking at about 60, 70 yards.
And this is a typical arrow from the period from around the 1860s. You were telling me that there were markings that were put on the arrows. What was the purpose of that?
Well, the markings were more like an identifier. It lets you know which warrior shot what arrow. A lot of times in buffalo hunt, you'd be able to tell which arrow brought down a buffalo. This way, your family could actually receive a portion of that meat. There's also lightning grooves, which go up and down the entire length of the arrow shaft. This served two purposes. For starters, the lightning was a symbol of power, and the traditional belief is that it helped the arrow fly farther and straighter. Secondarily, it was also a groove mark that prevented the arrow from warping in the sun.
Another good point is that the bow and arrow is a silent weapon. So that would make it an excellent choice for an ambush, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, without question. This way, you can't be identified as to where exactly it's coming from, or you could be up on a bluff or behind a tree, and there's really no telling.
The Native American silencer. You know, no matter how skilled the shooter, the bow and arrow just couldn't stand up to the power and range of the white man's rifle. Red Cloud's men had to get guns, but it wasn't just their technology that needed an upgrade. It was their tactics.
When Plains warriors charged into battle, it was every man for himself. Each of Red Cloud's warriors sought individual glory in the struggle against the white invaders. For the Plains Indian, the bravest act a man could perform in battle was called counting coup.
Counting coup was essentially riding up to your enemy on horseback and actually touching the enemy with a coup stick or a bow or war club or even your hand. That was considered braver than just killing your enemy, because anyone could just kill their enemy. But riding up to him and counting coup, which had to be acknowledged by another warrior, that was significant.
Coup stick could be anywhere from a staff to something as small as this, and range in different decorations and sizes.
Back at camp, witnesses told of these brave acts to the entire tribe. Tribal elders rewarded each coup with an eagle feather or an enemy scalp lock. A bold warrior could earn enough feathers to make a ceremonial headdress. It was the ultimate symbol of his status within the tribe.
The individual that wore the headdress could not make the headdress himself. It wasn't something that he just says, hey, you know, I've got enough feathers, I'm gonna go out and make one. The honor was bestowed upon him by his peers. And those peers would actually donate the feathers that they had gotten from striking coup and give it to that individual basically as an honor.
Counting coup may have brought honor to the Lakota warriors battling the army, but it also brought death. It was the inevitable result of a combat strategy in which every warrior was out for himself. Red Cloud and his men were losing battles and losing the war. The Lakota needed a new approach. Their answer was the ambush. And their first target, Fort Phil Kearny, a key outpost along the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming. It would turn out to be a slaughter. 10 a.m., December 21st, 1866. A woodcutting detail leaves the safety of Fort Phil Kearny and begins work within sight of the fort. An hour later, the woodcutters are charged by 10 Lakota warriors. Leading the assault, a fighter with a rapidly growing reputation for fearlessness, a young Lakota named Crazy Horse.
Crazy Horse is one of those Indian warriors that we have almost no information about his early life. In fact, there's a rumor that he was the son of a white trader. But certainly by the late 1860s, he'd become a prominent warrior. He was very daring, very brave, and showed great leadership qualities.
But Crazy Horse's attack against the woodcutters is a ruse. He wants the fort's commander, Colonel Henry Carrington, to send out help. Carrington takes the bait. Soon, a column of soldiers is on its way. They are commanded by an officer who has recently reported for duty at Fort Kearny, Captain William J. Fetterman.
Fetterman was a Civil War hero, and he was known to have said that with 80 men, he could ride through the whole Sioux Nation without a problem. Well, it just so happened that day he had 80 men.
When the Lakotas see Fetterman and his troops, they break off the fight and begin a slow but steady retreat. At one point, Crazy Horse ignores a barrage of rifle fire and dismounts to inspect one of his horse's hooves. Gradually, the Lakota lead Fetterman and his soldiers toward a distant slope called Lodge Trail Ridge.
Colonel Carrington warned him many, many times, do not go past Lodge Trail Ridge, because that was the point for which they could not be seen from the fort.
Carrington believes a large number of hostile forces are in the area. If Fetterman gets in trouble, he's on his own. The fort can't spare any more troops.
Well, Fetterman's ego, Crazy Horse sucked him into it. He chased these 10 Indians past the ridge, down into a valley on the other side, and there's a river down there that was heavily wooded.
Hidden among the trees, rocks, and high grass are 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors looking for vengeance. Wyoming Territory, December 1866. Crazy Horse and a small band of Lakota warriors have lured a column of 80 soldiers away from Fort Kearny down a distant slope called Lodge Trail Ridge. Hidden among the trees, 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors waiting in ambush. Army Captain William Fetterman has led his men into a trap from which there is virtually no hope of escape.
Fetterman's leading his men down off the hill, and they get out into that opening area, and then all of a sudden, here comes this swarm. He realized he was in trouble, so he tried to turn his men around and head back to the fort. And basically, he got as far as a ridge that's very strewn with rocks, and that's where they made their defense.
Some of Fetterman's soldiers have repeating rifles, like the Henry. This gun held up to 15 self-contained rounds at once, which could be chambered and readied for firing with the simple ratcheting of a lever beneath the hand grip. But most are armed only with Civil War-era muzzle loaders, rifles that must be reloaded after every shot and can only fire 2 to 3 rounds per minute. Those 2 to 3 rounds were no match at all for 10,000 razor-tipped arrows slicing through the air toward the soldiers from every direction.
In fact, there were so many arrows where we actually ended up hitting some of our own people.
Fetterman and all 80 of his soldiers quickly fall in a hail of deadly missiles.
80 men, 2,000 warriors, it didn't take much long. It was about 30 minutes, and the thing was over.
The disaster would go down in Western lore as the Fetterman Massacre. But in the minds of the Lakota and their allies, it was the first major victory in a war to take back their hunting grounds. The courage of Crazy Horse and his team of decoys paid off. Red Cloud's unified ambush strategy was also a winner. After the battle, adrenaline-charged warriors leapt on the soldiers' bodies, mutilating them in a variety of nasty ways. And it wasn't just to disgrace the dead soldiers.
It was so they wouldn't be a whole body in the afterlife in order to track them down. If they had no hands, they couldn't grab them. If they had no feet, they couldn't come after them. If they had no eyes, they were blind. They couldn't see. They would always be wandering around looking for their body parts, and there would be no threat.
In the minds of the Plains warriors, these spiritual considerations could not be ignored. Religion played an important role in their everyday lives. In fact, religion often dictated which technologies a warrior relied on most heavily. Each Plains tribesman nurtured what he referred to as his medicine. Medicine is a Native American's personal power, a combination, you might say, of luck, karma, personal judgment, courage, and charisma. And it was usually embodied in a particular animal or object, revealed to the warrior in a dream or vision.
Every warrior walked his own path. If he had a vision, he would go to a Wachashawakan or holy man or medicine man and have that vision interpreted. He may see an animal, he may see an object, and that would be considered one's own medicine. You would utilize this medicine going into battle. The belief was that if you held to your visions or you held to your medicine, that it would carry you through.
Images from a warrior's vision often decorated the circular rawhide shield he carried into combat. The warrior believed the power of the painted symbols would help protect him from enemy arrows and bullets. Of course, creating a medicine shield required paint technology.
War paint in itself, it was basically came from minerals. It would be ground down into very, very fine powder. And then it was usually mixed with a bear grease or a fat grease. Black came from burnt charcoal. White was from white clay. For blue, they actually used duck manure. Duck manure, when it comes out, it's blue. So they would take it, dry it into a fine powder. That was put in the water, and of course it became its blue color.
The paint went on smooth, like water off a duck's. Never mind.
A warrior's vision also dictated the way he dressed and painted himself for battle. This was especially notable in the case of Crazy Horse and his vision.
His was of a fractious horse with a great warrior in the sky, being pelted by hailstones with lightning bolts. And this he took as his particular strong medicine, something that he would emulate.
To harness the spiritual power revealed to him by his vision, Crazy Horse would later ready himself for battle by painting a lightning bolt on his face and dotting his horse, and sometimes his own body, with white hail spots. As it turned out, Crazy Horse was never struck by a bullet or an arrow in a major battle.
Nothing crazy about that.
War paint not only depicted medicine symbols, it also acted as a weapon in a sort of psychological warfare.
You can see that paint from a long distance, and that told a lot about that particular warrior, what society he might belong to, what his accomplishments were. And if you had a particular society that was known for fierce fighters, well, then that played a psychological effect. And if you can see that that person had a lot of coup marks on his horse, you know, he was a particular fierce warrior.
The intimidating psychological effect of war paint was not lost on another breed of warrior more than a half-century later. During World War II, the men of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Unit striped their faces with war paint to look fearsome for the D-Day landing. Vision medicine not only determined how a Native American painted himself for the fight, it also strongly influenced personal ritual, and sometimes it made things taboo for a warrior. One such belief may have been the undoing of a great Cheyenne fighter named Roman Nose.
Roman Nose was a big, strapping Cheyenne warrior, unusually large for an Indian. He would always try to be in the forefront of any kind of attack. Despite this large size, he was described as a magnificent horseman. So in all ways, although he was not a chief, he led by example as one of the great warriors of the Cheyenne.
Roman Nose always wore a flowing headdress into battle. He believed the war bonnet possessed a special medicine that made him bulletproof, but its power only worked as long as he avoided certain things. One taboo was that he should never take a wife. Another was that he should never eat a meal that had been prepared or served with metal utensils. September 17, 1868, a combined Lakota and Cheyenne camp on the Arikari River in eastern Colorado, gets word the U.S. cavalry has been spotted downstream. Warriors paint their bodies, gather their best weapons and ponies, and prepare to fight. Roman Nose is among them. As he readies himself, he eats a small meal.
Unbeknownst to him, a squaw had stabbed some food to serve to him with an iron fork. He didn't know it. Before he knew it, he ate some of the food. Well, now this was very bad medicine.
Before he leaves to join the battle, Roman Nose learns that he has violated a sacred taboo, and there's no time to perform the elaborate purification rituals required to restore his power. The war party makes its way downstream and attacks the cavalry unit. In successive charges, some 700 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors assault what turns out to be just a few Army officers leading some 57 civilian scouts. Despite the estimated 5,000 arrows ripping through the air, the small group of white officers and scouts is able to turn to one of the most important technological advancements in the West, the Spencer rifle.
They were 7-shot lever-action repeaters. They weren't much for distance, and they didn't carry that big a wallop, but they were accurate, and they could fire fairly rapidly. Dozens of Indians went down.
Roman Nose observes the action from a bluff in the rear, feeling vulnerable.
And it wasn't until one warrior came back and chastised him for hiding out back and not going and fighting in front that Roman Nose went into battle.
Roman Nose inspires the warriors as he leads a ferocious charge. As the Great Cheyenne reaches the enemy, a trooper hidden in the grass blasts him in the back at nearly point-blank range. The death of Roman Nose deflated the warrior attack, and the soldiers were able to hang on until help could arrive. But before the epic saga of the West was finished, Native Americans would get their hands on technology that would spell the doom of thousands of less fortunate white invaders of the Great Plains.
When it came to moving people, goods, and weapons, the Native Americans relied on a dependable piece of what you might call natural technology. Think of this as the original 1-horsepower engine. It was also a mobile weapons launching platform. Comanche warriors were so skilled on horseback, the famed Indian fighter George Crook called the Comanche the best light cavalry the world has ever known. I bet you didn't know. Plains tribes only had horses for the last couple hundred years. Before that, dogs were used to haul stuff around the prairie, kind of like the Eskimos. And as Will Rogers said, the Indians were just Eskimos who moved a little further south. When a dog broke down, it was chow time for Rover. But he wasn't eating. That's right. Native Americans would sometimes eat their dogs. It was a perfect representation of the Indians' practical approach to prairie life. Why let that meat go to waste?
Until the Spanish brought horses to North America in the 1500s, dogs were the workhorses of the prairie.
We relied on the dog for virtually everything. They would carry our loads and carry our food, and when we moved, the dog was a beast of burden.
The dog alone wasn't strong enough to carry much on its back, but it could pull up to a couple of 100 pounds when it was hitched to a clever contraption called a travois. A travois was made up of 2 long branches with smaller cross-sections to support the load. It was strapped to a dog, which would drag the apparatus like a sled. But before the dogs had anything to drag, the hunters had to make a kill. This was easier said than done for tribesmen on foot. The best way to kill buffalo at the time was not by trying to chase the animals down, but by using their herd mentality against them.
we had what we called runners. And what these runners would do is they would run alongside the buffalo, and we'd have warriors along a certain path in which we wanted to direct them with blankets, jumping up and flashing the blankets to kind of lead the buffalo down a certain trail towards what we called a buffalo jump, which was usually a cliff.
The name of one buffalo jump in Alberta, Canada summed it up perfectly. It was called Head Bashed In.
That's one place I don't want to visit.
Running buffalo off a cliff was a gory business, but it was the only way to ensure a large enough kill to feed, clothe, and shelter an entire tribe over a long winter. But in the late 1600s, hunting strategies changed. Thanks to the horse, of course. Horses gradually made their way north from Spanish settlements in Mexico. Their arrival revolutionized daily life for Plains Indians. The use of the buffalo jump gradually gave way to hunting from horseback. This was more efficient. Warriors didn't need to run whole herds over a cliff. On horses, they could chase down and kill only the number of animals needed for survival. No doubt about it, chasing down a running buffalo herd took nerves of steel.
And some sizable cojones. That's Spanish for courage.
This is a wild buffalo herd. Stampeding. You're riding a horse, bareback, with one little rope tied around its neck, with your hands being occupied with a bow or with a rifle. It was very dangerous. That horse could step in a hole. It could be knocked over by the buffalo. You could lose your seat. So many things that could have happened.
So how did a hunter guide his horse while his hands were occupied? And how did he convince the animal to charge toward danger in the first place? Through gradual training that started very early.
From the minute that that horse was old enough for him to climb on its back, he was training it, using his knees to get it to turn left or right. There's been instances where they've been known to actually train the horse to charge a tree, and at the very last minute, he would give it a signal with his knee to veer. So that horse would know not to deviate until he got those signals from his knees.
The Comanche were possibly the most skilled horsemen in the history of America. They routinely performed feats like slipping to the side of a galloping mount and shooting arrows under its neck. The horse gave the Comanche tremendous mobility, which upped the stakes for both the white man and for rival tribes all across the southern plains. Comanche warriors thought nothing of raiding enemy camps hundreds of miles away. But traveling that great a distance could lead to problems with long-range communication. Smoke signals were one way to keep in touch. They were the Native American version of the telegraph. Warriors threw wet or green grass on a hot fire to make dense white smoke, and then broke up the rising smoke column with a blanket to send signals. But there was also an easier way to warn of danger or coordinate an attack long range.
Nothing could be simpler. A common mirror, right? But this was a fantastic signaling device on the prairie. Plains warriors traded for them. Then it was easy to send information to their cohorts over long distances. One flash might mean attention. 2 flashes for all's well. And 3 flashes for can you hear me now? If the sun wasn't shining, they couldn't. But on a sunny day, the flash from a good mirror could be seen up to 50 miles away. In fact, the U.S. Army may have borrowed the idea. It began using signal mirrors soon after arriving on the plains. But they didn't even say thanks to the Native Americans for this flash of inspiration.
Like the Lakota and the Cheyenne, the Comanche resented white encroachment on their territory. They burned and pillaged white farms and settlements. A ruthless warrior named Quanah Parker led one of the most aggressive groups of Comanche raiders. Quanah's mother was a white woman, A captive taken at an early age, he adored her, and he took her English surname, Parker, for himself. But his affection for whites ended with her. Quanah considered himself pure Comanche, and he was determined to preserve the free-ranging Comanche way of life. The U.S. Army had other plans. September 1871. Army commanders have vowed to put an end to Comanche raids on white settlers in northwest Texas. Famed Civil War Colonel Ranald Slidell Mackenzie sets out from Fort Richardson, Texas, with 600 troops. His mission? To hunt down Quanah Parker and his people. Mackenzie plans to break his will and force Parker to submit to reservation life at all costs. What Mackenzie doesn't know is that cost will be paid in blood. Northwest Texas, September 1871. Chief Quanah Parker and his Comanche raiders have been burning and plundering white farms and settlements. They're trying to drive the intruders from tribal homelands. The U.S. Army intends to kill Quanah and his warriors or drive them onto a reservation. The Army has sent one of its toughest officers in to do the dirty work, Ranald Slidell Mackenzie.
By this time, he was a colonel, had been one of those boy wonders during the Civil War, had risen to great prominence, West Point graduate, everything on his military resume to recommend him.
Mackenzie takes 600 soldiers from Fort Richardson and starts looking for Quanah's camp. Parker is not intimidated and plans a counterattack. In classic guerrilla fashion, Quanah Parker dispatches small groups of mounted warriors to take quick jabs at Mackenzie's marching column. Quanah himself leads a nighttime raid and makes off with Colonel Mackenzie's personal mount. After a month of fruitless marching and scores of small but frustrating losses, Mackenzie finally calls it quits. He heads back to Fort Richardson to regroup. Quanah Parker and his mounted raiders have bought a few more months of life on the open range. Colonel Mackenzie's column of soldiers never did reach Quanah's home ground, but even if they had, it still would have been tough to locate a Comanche village. Plains tribes like the Comanche and the Lakota lived in portable tent-type lodges called teepees. How portable? Women and children could easily take down camps and get out of harm's way.
Since we were nomadic people, we could pack the teepee up relatively quickly in an hour and move it beyond the road. So it was a perfect design for living on the northern plains, especially following the buffalo and adapting to our surroundings.
Not only was the teepee quick and easy to move, it was architecturally solid as a rock. This lightweight shelter, made of a few poles and animal hide or canvas, could withstand gale-force winds. A three-pole tripod system forms the basic structure of the lodge. Once these heavier poles are in place, several lighter poles help round out the teepee shape. A final pole lifts the rolled canvas cover to its full height. The two sides of the cover are joined together with wooden pegs, and stakes of wood or metal secure the bottom edge of the canvas to the ground. Next comes the most crucial component of the system, the liner.
It compressed the area inside the lodge a small degree, so it made it easier to heat and maintain the heat in there. There was a storage space behind that liner. The liner itself came right down onto the ground for the most part, while the lodge cover set up off the ground. This creates an area where the wind can come into the lodge and travel up between the lodge cover and the liner and that acts as a natural chimney flue to draw the smoke straight up and out through the smoke flaps.
And now for my favorite piece of TP technology, the Native American lounge chair. You start with a bunch of willow sticks, strip off the bark, cut them to size, and then they're all held together with this strip of buffalo sinew. And here at the top, a leather loop fits over one of the poles of this tripod support stand. You set up your tripod, and then you hook this leather loop over one of the ends of the tripod, and presto, instant easy chair. Y'all go ahead. I think I'll just hang out here a while.
In most cases, women owned the family teepee and were responsible for maintaining and moving it. That was only fair. Usually, she had built it. And in case of divorce, she kept it.
Some things never change.
But while women may have owned the teepees and run the camp, it was the men's job to defend it. And it was the defense of a camp on the Little Bighorn River in 1876 that resulted in the most legendary Indian versus cavalry battle in the history of the West. Stick around, and you might learn a little something about the famous Custer fight you didn't know before. By the summer of 1876, many once powerful warrior societies of the Great Plains had succumbed to U.S. government pressure. They were confined to reservation lands. Even the mighty Red Cloud, the one-time scourge of the Bozeman Trail, led his band of Oglala Lakota onto a reservation in Nebraska. His painful decision to do so was no doubt helped along by a shocking and eye-opening journey he took into enemy territory. Red Cloud hoped to negotiate with the white government.
He went to Washington, saw the inevitability of the white men coming, and basically changed his ways, realized that for the greater good of the people, to absorb the Eastern philosophy and change our way of life and go to the reservation was going to be the mainstay for the people, the only way that we were going to survive.
He saw the big cities and the large amount of people. He just became a realist, is what I think it amounts to.
But there were still a few holdouts among the Lakota who had no intention of giving in to white pressure. Prominent among them was Crazy Horse, Red Cloud's lead decoy at the Fetterman fight 10 years earlier. Now in his late 20s, Crazy Horse had become a respected leader in the battle against white encroachment.
He was fighting for the right to live as he always lived, and for his people to always live that way. And I think he didn't ask for anything more. He didn't settle for anything less.
In the last week of June 1876, several Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warrior bands gathered in a valley of the Little Bighorn River in southeastern Montana. Earlier that spring, the U.S. Army had issued an ultimatum. Any Indians who refused to report to the reservations would be deemed hostile and dealt with accordingly. Several warrior bands had ignored the ultimatum.
Finally, the government decided to do something about it, and they sent various Army units out there, including elements of the 7th Cavalry. And one of those elements was led by George Custer.
The bands now gathered on the Little Bighorn. Between 1,500 and 2,500 warriors in total would soon be tested in battle. Shortly after noon on June 25th, the attack came. Without properly scouting the encampment, Colonel George Custer led his men against the Native Americans. Custer had fewer than 500 soldiers. Now, most people probably know that Custer was outnumbered in this fight, but it might be news to you that he was also outgunned. The Indians had Winchesters.
In Little Bighorn, we had many repeating rifles that we'd gotten on the high plains through trade and raids. Whereas if we didn't have the gun, I mean, even though the soldiers were way outnumbered, we would have had many more losses.
Most of these repeating rifles weren't exactly in mint condition, but in many cases, Native American warriors had made the guns more suitable for combat on horseback.
Because they used their rifles on horseback, they shortened the barrels. They didn't need that long barrel for long distance. They needed a short barrel for easy handling and to get up close to their game or their enemy.
Many tribesmen also removed excess metal to make the guns lighter to carry.
This is an 1873 Winchester. One of the things they did was they took the forearm off because they probably needed the wood for something else. They took the piece that held the forearm off, probably made an arrowhead out of it, and then reinforced it with rawhide. This up on top is wire to hold the barrel and the magazine tube together.
The wire wrap was probably taken from a telegraph line.
And they tacked the stock, probably roped it, and then reinforced it with rawhide. This made it stronger than it originally was. And on this rifle, we have no butt plate. The butt plate was removed. One of the reasons for that is they needed the metal as a hide scraper, and they would use it as a tool.
Ironically, while many warriors carried Winchester repeating rifles at Little Bighorn, the latest in firearms technology, the guns in the hands of the white soldiers could only fire one shot with each loading. Repeating arms had yet to reach U.S. military arsenals. To make matters worse, many soldiers were carrying faulty ammunition, which often jammed their weapons. The casings were made of copper, which could deform or even break during extraction. Throughout the course of the battle, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho men fought with fanatical enthusiasm, led boldly by Crazy Horse and other senior warriors.
Their motivation was saving their family. You know, here you've got this foreign people coming in, invading your land. You got your wife, your children, your family members all down there. You're going to do everything that you can to protect that.
The outcome of the battle is well known. The warrior encampment overwhelmed Custer's forces. The colonel's rash decision to attack an unknown enemy ended his own life and the lives of more than 200 of his men. Ultimately, the battle would also eventually seal the fate of Crazy Horse himself. Soon, he and his followers would be hunted to the point of near starvation.
The Army this time sent many forces into the field from many different directions and pursued the Indians and pursued them and pursued them and pursued them and wore them down in the months following the Little Bighorn.
Finally, to bring an end to the suffering of the women and children under his care, Crazy Horse turned himself over to reservation authorities in Nebraska. Four months later, he was bayoneted in the back, killed while resisting arrest.
American Indians lived off the land, and their practical technology served them well for centuries. But times changed. The white man brought advanced weapons and tools to the West. Native Americans adapted as best they could, but in the end, were overmatched. By 1890, all the Plains tribes were forced onto reservations, where few of their time-honored traditions survived. Technology told the tale of how the West was won or lost, depending on your point of view. I'm Keith Carradine, and until our next powwow, I'm out of here.
There are only 3 episodes left, and this week, 3 men are missing.
Driver.
The rookie is one of them.
Hope that I don't end up swimming and swimming.
Don't miss the next.
And this Red Cloud would not tolerate. Lakota warriors began raiding traffic on the Bozeman Trail and attacking soldiers and civilians who ventured from the forts to cut and gather wood. But the Lakota couldn't drive the soldiers away. The problem wasn't one of numbers. Red Cloud had gathered hundreds of warriors. But the Lakota's primary weapon, the bow and arrow, was more than 2,000 years old, hardly the latest technology. Early arrows were tipped with brittle stones, such as flint or obsidian. A stone was chipped or napped to a sharp point, then lashed to the end of an arrow shaft with animal tendon. It's believed the bow and arrow was first brought to the Great Plains sometime between 500 and 600 BC. Later, European traders supplied tribes with prefabricated metal tips that had often been hand-forged by blacksmiths in Europe. These thinner, flatter steel tips fit much more easily and securely into wooden arrow shafts and had greater durability than stone. As white settlers ventured onto the plains, warriors found another source for metallic arrowheads.
We would take barrel hoops or wagon wheels and take the iron from that and manufacture arrow points out of iron.
At the opposite end of the arrow, fletching made of bird feathers helped stabilize the missile in flight.
There's fletching of hawk feathers, wild turkey wings, which was much more suitable under many conditions. They're a lot more durable. Eagle feathers were seldom used at all, just because of the fragility of the feather.
A Plains Indian carved bows from hard woods like ash, hickory, and Osage orange. The bow string was made from 5 or 6 strands of buffalo tendon or sinew, braided to form a tough cord.
What sinew was basically the muscle fiber, the tendon that ran along either the backbone of the elk or buffalo or its leg. And it's a very wide tendon, and it could be basically ripped apart into very fine fibers or strings, so to speak, and it's very, very strong. You cannot break it with your hand.
This is Aaron Ten Bears of the Lakota Nation. He's going to tell us about that most familiar piece of Native American technology, the bow and arrow. Aaron, these bows that you have here, are these typical from the 1860s?
Yeah, they sure are. They're seldom longer than 3 feet in length, so this way they're easily be adaptable and able to be fired on horseback.
And what was the typical range of this weapon?
Well, there are different variations of the short bow. These are what we call a self bow. They're not sinew-backed, and this would be the back of the bow. Sometimes they place sinew or rawhide or even snakes.
The Native American was a technological expert of the plains, turning simple natural materials into some of the most deadly armaments and effective survival gear of all time. He built tents that could stay put in a raging storm, and weapons to bring down a rampaging beast. But it was the American Indians' fighting spirit that put the fear of God into some of the baddest hombres who ever set out across the frontier.
Native Americans, next on Wild West Tech. Send up the smoke signals. Howdy, I'm Keith Carradine. If you were a Native American looking for a fight on the plains, you didn't have to look far. Sure, there was the white man, but tribes also fought each other. Many times it wasn't personal, just business. A quick and easy way to get your hands on some horses. In fact, any technology that could help a warrior was welcome. If that meant trading with the white man, so be it. But trading and tolerance only went so far. Sometimes the only way for an American Indian to respond to the white man's assault on the frontier was with total annihilation.
It was a fight that stretched for decades. A bloody clash scarred the last half of the 19th century. Native American warriors battled U.S. soldiers for dominance on the Great Plains. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were trying to hang on to traditional homelands. These territories stretched from the western borders of Iowa and Missouri to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, all the way from Canada to Mexico. In the fall of 1866, the conflict reached a proud Lakota war chief named Red Cloud. The U.S. Army had recently built 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail, a frontier wagon road that cut right through the heart of prime Lakota hunting grounds.
The Bozeman Trail was developed by John Bozeman about 1864 to carry goods. By that time, there had been several gold strikes out in the western part of Montana, and they needed a quicker, more direct route.
The constant rumble of Army supply wagons scared away the elk and buffalo herds, crucial to the Lakota's way of life.
Skin to help compound the bow and make it a little bit more powerful. So the average range on a self-bow, you'd be looking at about 60, 70 yards.
And this is a typical arrow from the period from around the 1860s. You were telling me that there were markings that were put on the arrows. What was the purpose of that?
Well, the markings were more like an identifier. It lets you know which warrior shot what arrow. A lot of times in buffalo hunt, you'd be able to tell which arrow brought down a buffalo. This way, your family could actually receive a portion of that meat. There's also lightning grooves, which go up and down the entire length of the arrow shaft. This served 2 purposes. For starters, the lightning was a symbol of power, and the traditional belief is that it helped the arrow fly farther and straighter. Secondarily, it was also a groove mark that prevented the arrow from warping in the sun.
Another good point is that the bow and arrow is a silent weapon, so that would make it an excellent choice for an ambush, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, without question. This way, you can't be identified as to where exactly it's coming from, or you could be up on a bluff or behind a tree, and there's really no telling.
The Native American silencer. You know, no matter how skilled the shooter, the bow and arrow just couldn't stand up to the power and range of the white man's rifle. Red Cloud's men had to get guns, but it wasn't just their technology that needed an upgrade. It was their tactics.